Okay, welcome to everybody to this new section of the Education Builder program. And this section is titled Educate to Visualize. And we have three very nice talks today. And the first is titled How to Write a Visualization Survey Paper, a Starting Point. And it is presented by Laramee.
Happy Wednesday, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk. It's good to see that there are some people that are interested in the topic. So the title is How to Write a Visualization Survey Paper, a Starting Point, with a special emphasis on the word starting. And I'm presenting this on behalf of McNabb, who is a PhD candidate at Swansea University, waiting for his defense, or a viva, as we call it in the UK. One little comment before I start. If there are any questions or comments, feel free to interrupt at any time. I actually enjoy interruptions. I'm kind of strange like that. And I definitely enjoy questions. So this is meant to serve as a starting point for those that are new to writing survey papers, although I do think it will be quite interesting for people that have experience writing survey papers as well. And anybody that's tried this or is trying this will know that it's difficult. So it's difficult to write a survey paper. And if you do some searching for guidelines, especially in visualization or graphics, you'll find that it's very difficult to find any sort of guidelines, detailed guidelines. Now this is also no substitute for experience or a supervisor. This is meant to kind of help you and your supervisor, especially your both of you, yeah. And this paper goes through section by section of what the survey paper contains. So your survey paper is in a bunch of sections, and it really goes through section by section, giving recommendations about the content and the structure of every section. This is an overview of the paper itself. If you have the impression there's a lot of topics in there, it's because there are. And we won't actually have time to go over all those topics in this talk, so I'm leaving some of them out because it's only 25 minutes. I guess it would take about an hour to go through all those things in more detail. That's just to say, have a look at the PDF if you want to know more details about some of the things that we didn't talk about. And another little announcement, this is a piece of a larger effort called the PhD in Visualization Starter Kit. This is a piece of the PhD in Visualization Starter Kit. And I'll just quickly, if you can find my webpage, you'll see something called the PhD in Visualization Starter Kit. This is very useful for graphics too, and it's a number of steps. But 6 steps, like how to conduct effective meetings with your supervisor, how to read individual research papers. This is step 2 that we're talking about today, how to write a survey paper. There are recommendations on your implementation, coding conventions. There are debugging strategies, visual debugging strategies covered in there. And then finally, how to write guidelines on writing your first visualization paper. And those are all refereed conference and journal papers. And to complement that, we have something called a Doctoral Training Center playlist. So it's on the database YouTube channel. So all of these topics have been covered in lectures, different public lectures. And they've all been recorded and archived for people that prefer presentations, for example, over PDFs. And sometimes it's nice to sit down and read a PDF, but some people like to watch lectures and so all of these topics are covered on the database YouTube channel, and there are some additional topics covered in there. But like all the basic topics from the PBSK are covered on there as well. Okay, so let's get on with it. The abstract. So everybody knows, everybody here has written abstracts before, I'm guessing. Sometimes people start with an abstract. It's one good starting point for writing a survey. It's not the only good starting point. Another good starting point is the related work section. But we can start with the abstract. It's roughly 6 to 12 sentences. That's a very rough guideline, by the way. In those 6 to 12 sentences, you have to do a few things, right? Identify the survey topic. Everybody knows that. You have to describe also why it's useful, though. Why is that topic? What's the motivation for choosing that topic? And why is it helpful? You have to also identify the goals of the literature review. So your literature group has some goals and some objectives. You want to identify those. And then what benefits and advantages does your presentation bring? This is one aspect that a lot of people leave out by accident. Like, okay, you've done all that work, now what are the benefits of having done all that work? And in the PDF itself, we've written a sample abstract that tries to follow its own guidelines. And just for the fun of it, I looked back and counted the some number of sentences in there, and it's 7. The next is the introduction section. Yeah, the word introduction is not very helpful, actually. If you just crossed out the word introduction, you would lose nothing from the paper, basically from all papers. So when you write the introduction, the actual word that is more helpful to think about is motivation. The introduction should really be called motivation. So what is your survey good for is a very important question when you're writing your introduction. Right? So the importance of your survey is described, the benefits and advantages of the survey are described, and we also recommend a bulleted list of contributions that your survey brings right in the introduction, just to make it clear for the reviewers, basically. Another great content to mention in the introduction are the major challenges in the field you're addressing. So whatever survey field you're working on, it will have a unique, well, a specific set of challenges that dominate the field. And those are very good to mention in the introduction right up front. And that's tied very closely to the motivation. So just some generic examples of major research challenges that recur often. Data set sizes, this is always mentioned in visualization papers, ever-growing data set sizes, uncertainty, heterogeneous data sources, cognition and perception, very common challenges, existing limitations and performance. And as a forward-looking hint, these challenges can be used as a classification dimension. So we'll talk about classification dimensions later on. But it helps also give the paper a nice thread, so to speak, a nice connection through the different sections. And we provide an example introduction in the survey itself that tries to follow their own guidelines, so to speak. Now, a special note about the contributions, because they're so much fun and they're so important, right? That's kind of the whole point in some ways. Each contribution and benefit your survey provides is explicitly given in a bulleted list. I don't know how many people have had this experience before, but I've certainly had papers rejected because the contributions were not explicit enough, or the reviewer was not sure what the contributions were. So, glad you can make it. And so that's why we advocate making the contributions explicit. And I've certainly also turned down papers myself for not being sure what the contribution is. So some typical contributions of a literature survey are: does your literature survey provide some sort of new classification? That's a very typical contribution. Is it the first survey of its kind? That's a nice contribution, if you could produce something like that. It can also update an older survey, so if there's a survey on your topic that's 10 years old, it's great to update it. Does it provide some list or guidance on future trends or unsolved problems or challenges in the field? That's a nice contribution. Does it identify mature areas of research and areas that are less explored? And so the idea is you want to make sure you have your contributions explicitly identified right up front in the introduction. And I don't know exactly why, but I always look for 3. I'm not sure why. I just like 3 contributions in the introduction. Maybe Tom has an opinion on that.
It's a good number, but
It's a good number.
It's your talk.
A little bit on temporal planning. I would love to hear other people's opinion on this topic, by the way. I think it's a good idea to allocate a full year to a survey, or at least the first draft. So, in Swansea, for example, we incrementally work on surveys and compare them over about a year's time span. And a lot of that time is spent just looking for related literature, because it's difficult to find all the related papers on a given topic. Or it can be very difficult. Now, that topic starts to get very tricky. So, a full-length survey is typically around 20 to 30 pages. And you certainly don't want anyone to write 20 pages and then present it for review to their supervisor. That's not a good idea. What we recommend is writing 1 page and then presenting it to your supervisor to get incremental feedback along the way. Plus, it's very difficult to write 20 pages at once and then review 20 pages at once. So we're always working incrementally throughout the year, part-time on these surveys. And working on them full-time is really, really difficult too. So. And individual research paper summaries can be written on a weekly basis. This is a good exercise as part of a survey. And this topic is covered in a different lecture on how to read visualization research papers. If anybody's interested, that is step 1 of the PBSK. Some of the main challenges, a summary of main challenges. So I think most of the audience is familiar with these, but it's fun to identify them explicitly. So managing the amount of previously published literature. So we have talked about this in other lectures, and they're recorded on the Dataviz YouTube, the How to Read a Viz paper. The focus of that is this first major challenge, managing a large number of previously published papers. Identifying a starting point is very difficult for a survey, and that's what we're trying to address right now in this presentation. Deciding on a topic is very challenging, and that's closely related to deciding on the scope. The literature search is a challenge, and we're going to give some guidance on good places to look for your literature. Interpreting individual research papers is the topic of another lecture. Again, it's step 1 of the PBSK. Deriving a literature classification, this is one of the major challenges for the survey, and we're going to talk about that today. And of course, determining the unsolved problems. And we have strategies that we can offer to do that here today. And these are all detailed, given in more detail in the PDF, by the way, these things. I'm only going to give kind of a preview in some ways, an overview. So on the literature search methodology, here is a very helpful list of places we recommend searching for literature, especially for visualization, given in a nice compact form. Everybody knows about Google Scholar, the IEEE Explore Digital Library, the ACM Digital Library. Maybe not everybody here knows about the VizPub data source, which is a database of every Viz paper ever published at the main conference. That's something great to look at. And I think most people here are familiar with the remaining sources. Maybe some of you have not seen the ACM Computing Surveys journal before. In fact, we looked for visualization survey papers in there already, and I don't think we found a single one, surprisingly, so it's certainly not very popular amongst the Viz community. So in your literature search methodology subsection, you identify the sources of literature that you searched and the search terms you used in enough detail so that it's reproducible theoretically by someone else. You look in the related work section of the papers, the individual papers themselves. And you observe the number of papers on a topic. So if you've chosen a survey topic, look carefully at the number of related research papers you're getting back from the search engines. So if you do a search, for example, isosurface rendering, you might get something like 50 million papers back. So that's a little warning sign that says, like, you've chosen a topic that might be too broad, and you may need to narrow that to something like, I don't know, isosurface rendering of time-dependent data, for example, might be narrow enough, maybe. And if you're not sure, certainly collaborations help with this. Choosing a scope is definitely one of the major challenges in writing a Viz survey paper or any survey paper. This has to be done really with special care. So obviously you discuss that with your supervisor, right? Exploit your supervisor's many years of experience. By default, it's a good idea to choose a scope that's too narrow. You should start out with a topic that you think there are not enough papers on this topic to write a full survey. That's a good starting point, actually. Because it's much easier to have a narrow topic that you can broaden than it is to take a topic that's too wide and has too much breadth and narrow it afterwards. So the broadening is easier than the narrowing. This is a very common pitfall. It's very easy to choose a topic that is too big and too wide in scope. And you can get a feel for this by doing a preliminary search. When you're doing your preliminary search through all those digital libraries that we just mentioned, how many papers are you finding? Are you finding hundreds of papers on your topic? Then it's too broad. Right? You can find that out quickly. If you're experienced, you can find that out in 5 minutes or so. So it's definitely something you want to have a look at. Very rough guidelines. It's good to go for finding 20 to 25 research papers on your topic. In an initial search, say the first week of searching or the first 2 weeks of searching, that's a good number. Because inevitably, when you search for a longer time period, generally going to find more papers on that topic. And we suggest aiming for something like 50 papers in your survey per student supervisor pair. So the way this paper is written, it's assuming you're a PhD candidate, it's targeted at PhD candidates working with a supervisor. So a supervisor, PhD, candidate pair. That's the way it's written. You'll notice some surveys involve 4 people or 6 people or something like that. So it is possible to join 2 teams together to make it bigger. The bigger it is, the longer the co-author list is typically. And don't forget to search for existing surveys. Don't forget that part. And then you write a careful description of your scope in the introduction. Another major challenge is developing a literature classification. This is one of the major challenges of any viz survey paper. So literature classification divides up all the related papers and puts them into groups that make logical sense, where all the papers in a group have something in common, a number of characteristics in common, usually at least 2. In deriving these groups or categories and dimensions for your classification requires some planning and some thought. So common categories are often based on subtopics, recurring themes in the literature, data, or metadata attributes. Very, very common. Classification dimensions. Look for themes and topics and subtopics that occur over and over again in the literature. And you might discover that there are very natural subject-based clusters already just shouting out at you. And there are software tools that can help you find these subject-based clusters. It doesn't have to be done on a purely manual basis. Right? One's called Surveys, another one's called Mendeley. And then you also look for some characteristics that most of or not all of your papers have in common. For example, are they working on different types of data or the same type of data and so on. So data-centric classifications are very, very common. Data types classifications are very common. Now when we say classification dimensions, we're usually looking...
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I saw that as well on my stopwatch here. Here is an example of a classification, the type of classification we like to shoot for. There are 2 classifications here, so these are the individual papers. And we have a classification dimension called the information visualization pipeline, which goes through the different stages of the pipeline. And then we have subject-based clusters on the y-axis. So that's what we mean by classification dimension. And we often aim for 2D. This one is 3D because it has the x-axis, the y-axis, and then it also involves color. So you can test out different literature dimensions and you can start placing papers according to those dimensions. If you find that exercise easy, then you probably have a good classification scheme. If you find it very difficult, then you might need to rethink your classification. A 2D or a 3D classification scheme is very helpful because it helps to identify mature areas, like here's a mature area, for example, and immature areas where no little work has been done. And you can use tools to help you with this. It doesn't have to be done by hand. You can use tools like concordances or document similarity metrics to actually objectively group papers together. And just to jumpstart your literature classification, there are some suggestions here, some very common dimensions, like data dimensionality, visualization technique, visual design dimensionality, field challenge type, like in a few slides ago I mentioned the major field challenges. User task type, that's supposed to say user task. Application domain, data processing size, a very good candidate for classification. Performance is a good one, and so on. Here's another example of classification. Subject-based clusters along the x-axis, dimensionality along the y-axis. Another one is very similar, also along the color. And then finally, we're going to wrap up and just leave a few minutes for questions or comments. It's very helpful to include collective metadata that compares the papers and the groups of papers with one another. A common criticism of survey papers is this is just a list of papers. You need to also include some meta-analysis of the papers in your survey. How do they compare with one another? And how can you set up something that lets you compare them? So you'll see very often, for example, graphs of publication year versus number of papers published in that year, a histogram of papers published in your survey. Very, very common. You'll often see tables of publication venues, where the papers have been published, what conferences and journals. Sometimes you'll see those two aspects combined in the same graph. You also find things like the origin of the data. Where does the data come from for each paper? That can be used as a basis of comparison or metadata collection. The impact and citations is very common to compare papers that way. Every survey, for example, has a span of years that the literature is taken from. That can be used as a nice added metadata. And so on. These are all different types of metadata you can collect to construct your survey. And these are all characteristics of the papers you can use to compare them with each other. And they all are unused classification dimensions. So you may have thought of a number of classification dimensions, but you didn't use them all, so to speak, in your actual classification. Well, any unused ones can be used to compare the papers with one another and make that comparison that the reviewers really want to see. There's an example of some metadata that compares the different papers. This is a paper published in 1993, and there are all of its successors, and then we have a third generation of successors at the bottom row here. And then every paper is also given a dimensionality, it's described by its dimensionality. Okay, there's a discussion of tools in the PDF that you can use to help with your survey, like surveys, Mendeley, and there are a few more that I can't remember. And there's also the aspect of future challenges. What are the future challenges in the field and how do you identify them? And since we're kind of out of time, I'm going to leave that here. But I can say that I've given lectures on this topic before that last an hour, and you can find those on the Database YouTube channel if you want to see like a full, extended version of the presentation. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
What do you think of short papers? Should they also be
Sure.
included in the survey?
Yes, I do think short papers should be included in the survey, actually. As long as it's a refereed paper. So referee, short, full-length, conference, and journal papers. Those would be the main candidates. I thought you were going to ask, what about writing a short survey paper? And those do exist. But I don't have any special advice on them. That's different. Actually, in some ways, you may have noticed some groups write a short survey paper, publish it, and then publish the full-length extended version. And I think this is a very good strategy, actually. I think it's really good because it gives you some feedback, some intermediate feedback before you go for the full-length survey. And in fact, this is a strategy we are developing in the Swansea group.
Why do you start with the abstract? I mean, wouldn't it make sense, especially if you are not quite certain what the outcome of the whole survey will be, to actually wait with the abstract until you've written everything else?
Good question. Now, I would, in my opinion, an abstract is one good starting point, not the only good starting point. I think the related literature section is also a very good candidate for the starting point. And that hopefully included in that process is, are there any existing surveys on this topic already? Now, the reason I think the abstract is also a good starting point is because you must make some decisions. If you write an abstract, there are implicit decisions that have to be made when you're writing it. Like, what is the topic you're looking for? What are the benefits that it could bring? Why is the topic important? I think those are all good questions to think about before you start writing the rest. Like, if you, in my opinion, if you have no idea what the abstract is going to look like, then you're lost. Like,
No, I meant, you usually start with an idea to go with, but I mean, would you say that you should at least at some point probably revisit the abstract?
Definitely, yes. You would revise the abstract continuously. You revise it and update it continuously, for sure. But the related work section, I used to be of the opinion that the abstract, because I'm such a computer scientist and very linear in my thoughts, I used to think that an abstract was like the best starting point. But I have since changed my mind, and I think the related work section is probably the best starting point, because you want to make sure of existing surveys or the related work in the field before you start your own project.
Some questions? I have a question.
Okay.
Good question. How important is for you to be an expert in the field when you write a survey paper? Because for one side it's an advantage because you already know literature and whatever, but on the other side, maybe you introduce some bias towards your own research. Do you have an opinion about that?
It definitely has advantages and disadvantages. I would say if you're a new PhD candidate, you definitely want to be working with somebody that has experience in writing survey papers and hopefully having published them before to offer some guidance. Like, I would never recommend doing this without any experience and without any expertise. Like, I think it's just not a good idea. So there should be some leader with expertise, maybe not on that given topic, but at least expertise in writing literature surveys and hopefully publishing them as well.
So that's the next